Resident Evil has undergone a pretty sizable renaissance lately, and returned to that emphasis on atmosphere and resource management that I fell in love with back in the late 90s. This was of course after a decade or so long stint of fumbling around with more tone-deaf, action-oriented games, which weren't horrible games I guess, but I just didn't really care for them. Even though I did love Resident Evil 7, I'll admit I suspected it was an isolated experiment for Capcom, and they would be going back to the action format in no time, but now I'm happy to report that I was dead wrong about that. Capcom seems to be laser focused on keeping at least my attention with a complete remake of Resident Evil 2. As you can see, the first person perspective of RE7 is gone, but the same engine is still clearly intact and better than ever, with those slippery textures and nebulous shadows giving off that distinct look that made 7 such a visual standout. And I really enjoy how it all looks with that over-the-shoulder gameplay style, especially with how much visual emphasis your flashlight puts on the center of your vision while leaving everything else pretty much shrouded in darkness. The zombies themselves are perhaps the most detailed zombies I've ever seen. All of them look like they really could have been somebody unique, and even though by the end of the game I did notice some reused models, the depth with which they were designed still made every encounter much more personal and gripping than it had any right to be, and it appears that the same amount of thought went into the damage that they show and react to depending on where you shoot them, again adding to the immersion of dealing with them. Subtle touches in the sound design really went a long way here. Leon and Claire's footsteps often sound like they are purposefully made to sound a little further away than you would typically hear in a game like this, giving them a lot of unnerving distance in long hallways or a slight warm reverb in a smaller or more furnished room. The voice acting and sound effects pretty much all follow suit with the same philosophy. Just enough distance and reverb to sound distinctly real, but not so much that it's distracting or tacky. Again, these touches are subtle, but I think they go a long way to making the world feel much more gritty and alive than an overly polished Hollywood-style soundscape would. As far as the voice acting and performances go, I'd say it's pretty much a solid C across the board, with a small handful of outliers in negative and positive directions scattered throughout the game. And it really helps that the facial animations here are very next level and remind me of some Sony first-party stuff that we've been seeing. But the script and the story itself is still based on a 20-year-old game, so perhaps they were held back a little bit by that, especially the guy that played Leon, whose performance never really got above okay in my opinion, and often sank below that. Now, your mileage may vary depending on how important that kind of thing is to you, but for me, it seemed like maybe they could have done a better job.
That explains the horrible things I've seen.
The balance that every remake needs to strike is between integrating modern mechanics for today's sensibilities and holding on to that secret sauce that made the source material worth revisiting in the first place. I'd say 2019's Resident Evil 2 gets this about as right as we could probably ask for. Inevitably, a 20-year-old game is going to need some fundamental changes for a modern release, but I would say the gameplay style that was more or less pioneered by Resident Evil 4 and then slightly amended with games like Shadows of the Damned and the Evil Within games seems to be holding strong as a solid way to pull off a game like this. It doesn't always feel quite right though. Encounters with faster enemies like dogs or the Lickers can sometimes feel almost a little broken, as Leon has no dodge move or melee attack outside of the knife, which is a temporary weapon now, so these more nimble enemies just feel mismatched with Leon's moveset and the rest of the gameplay style, in my opinion. There is a quick turn move, and that does mitigate the problem somewhat, but overall, most of these intense moments feel like you're trying to swat a fly while drunk and covered in molasses. Most reviewers will probably tell you that you need to play both Leon's and Claire's campaign to get the full effect and see everything the game has to offer, and while that's technically true in a way, I still kind of disagree with that notion. While both characters do have a handful of their own story beats and a few things are switched around, one playthrough isn't so different from the other that you really need both in order to understand what the game is about. Make no mistake though, I'm very glad Capcom went the extra mile and included both campaigns. I just wouldn't say that that they're both absolutely necessary to have a full experience. Now, as a general rule, I do tend to prefer new games with new stories to remakes and remasters of old ones. I would have preferred to have gotten a sequel to Resident Evil 7 this year than a remake of 2. But I won't deny that Capcom has largely delivered on its goal to successfully transfer the soul of an old classic game into the body of a perfectly decent modern horror game, while creating very few negative byproducts. In my opinion, a handful of issues do exist, and they do keep the game from being what I would call excellent or outstanding, but the final product is still a great survival horror game and arguably stands as one of the best entries in the Resident Evil series at this point.